Is buying real estate a wealth builder? So we have different people who have different views on this matter. Cody Sanchez believes that buying real estate can be a beneficial way of building wealth. Ramit Sethi is among the list of people who believes that buying a house is not a means of wealth building. So who's correct? Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome back to Ira Living. In today's video, we're going to be exploring whether or not buying a house, a domicile, has any benefit in helping us to build and accumulate wealth. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 pros, 3 cons of buying houses and then be able to make a decision.
Go buy a house. You should rent.
What's your take on buying versus renting?
Well, multiple aspects. One, I think we have to not just look at what the math says, which is that sometimes it's cheaper to rent, especially if you add in all additional costs to it, and say the average American has, let's see, so what is it? 60% of Americans have $1,000 saved up, and something like 30% of Americans have no savings. And so if that's true, and the numbers are anywhere near that, anything that we can do to have assets that increase wealth over time and mandate that we have an ability to save with earnings increases are probably good. And so I think sometimes people talk about this and they're like, no, you shouldn't do it because, like Ramit Sethi is sort of famous for this line, but we shouldn't do it because in fact you should allocate your money somewhere else and it'll make you more money. That's like the argument there, except that most people don't keep their money in the stock market when the stock market goes down. And so you can't use like the average return of the stock market, which might be 10%, because people get emotional and they pull things in and out. So that's why I think behavioral economics is really important, overlaid on top of hard math and investment returns. So for me, I know that most Americans' net worth is largely tied up in their homes, for instance, and that might be good considering our behavioral economic patterns of not really saving at all.
Well, it's the same. We all have these things that society has told us, but then we don't quite agree and we're not sure what to do. Last time I was here, we talked about how you don't necessarily need to buy a house in order to live a rich life. And in my case, I have rented for the last 20 years by choice, and I made more money renting and investing the difference than I would have by buying a house. And this is shocking to people. Like, we saw the comments last time. People went berserk. How can you talk about renting? You're just throwing money away on rent. And this is something we have been fed constantly for generations, that in order to be successful, you must buy a house. So when somebody like me comes around and says, actually, you should run the numbers because sometimes renting can be better, people are shocked.
So who's correct? We're going to have a look at some of the pros and some of the cons and look at exploring the benefits, if there are any, of using real estate in order to help us to build some wealth. So that's buying a house, which is a domicile. And we're going to explore 3 pros and 3 cons to then be able to help us to make a decision. Now, firstly, before we start, let's just have a look at the things surrounding buying a house in the first place. So firstly, when we're looking at buying property and making commitment with any investment, one of the key things to consider is the why. Why are we doing it? Now, the people who are against using it as a means of wealth building highlight the fact that the cost of rent leaves you free of certain responsibility because you are then able to save on the cost of maintenance and some of the limitations and restrictions that you have from owning a home, because you are using that money to just pay rent, and the additional expenses that you would pay to service a mortgage and the maintenance cost for a property could be used for investment. Those who are for say that the people who would be buying houses and are buying it for certain feeling of accomplishment would not be investing their money in the stock market, especially when the stock market goes down. And therefore, those yields and benefit that is being forecasted would not necessarily be something that they would profit from. And therefore, this would be a good way for them to start to build up a nest egg so that they can have for later on in the future. Now, with these in mind, let's just explore this a little bit deeper. Now, when we're buying a house, it is important that what we're doing is not going to make us equity rich and cash poor. So it means that we're not going to be in a position where the house that we buy owns us rather than we own it, where we are struggling and stressing to make the payments, to do the maintenance work that are required simply because we want to own a house because we think that that is better. Rather, we should be able to be in a position where when we make the commitment to buying a house, it is something that we can afford to pay the cost for and make our lives less stressful in the long run. Now, it's always going to be down to the individual to decide what is better, because no one size fits all when it comes to investment and wealth building. It is particular to the way in which you decide that you are going to play out your card that you've selected for the life that you want to live, and how you want to accrue your funds and invest them for your advantage. So now we're going to look at some of the pros and some of the cons to try and see if we can get to a consensus and help with making the decision if you are contemplating buying a house as part of your way of building wealth whilst addressing your accommodation needs. Those who see buying a house as a wealth builder sees it as an opportunity for the homeowner to build wealth as the property value is growing, and also they are paying down their mortgage expenditure. And therefore, for people who aren't necessarily putting away a lot of money to save in the now, but are actually paying down their mortgages, are able to grow some level of equity in the property where they are living, and although they are maintaining, they are still managing to ride the tide as the property market increases and the value of real estate increases, providing they are making the necessary maintenance as they are progressing. Now, on the other hand to that, there are people who view this as something that requires high levels of maintenance cost, and therefore the amount of money that is going to be spent on the maintenance negates or nullify the amount of equity that is built up, because those expenditures need to be taken into consideration when one is considering the amount of equity that they've built up in the property over the period of ownership. Another point that those who are for consider is the fact that this becomes an opportunity for some families to be able to have inheritance that they can generate to pass on to their offsprings, or to be able to leave a legacy and generational wealth building for their offsprings and for the children that are going to be left after them. Whereas people on the opposing side to this idea sees this as high capital gains expenses that are going to be needing to be paid, or high inheritance charges and taxes that are going to be needing to be paid should this be passed on this way. Whereas other forms of equity building could be passed on with less of these tax burdens for those people who are inheriting or benefiting from it for the future. Those who are for buying see the expenses that are going to be long-term as predictable. They know what those are going to be, and they find a sense of safety, security, autonomy, and privacy, knowing that they're living in an accommodation that is their own and hence will not be violated by landlords or by the end of terms of contracts of that sort, and therefore finds that home buying would be the better option or pathway to take when one is trying to see how they can build out wealth and provide themselves with safe living arrangements simultaneously. Those who are against sees this as a risk, because although house prices have shown an upward trajectory, things can happen that can lead to the downturn and a decrease in value of property in particular areas and regions for various reasons. And they also see it as something that restricts people and their movement and mobility because of the fact that they are set to a specific location, and therefore can be a hindrance in them taking up opportunities further afield simply because they're tied to that location where their house is. Now, these are some of the pros and some of the cons that we've explored here. What are some of the things that you think would be a positive reason for you to buy a house? And also, what are some of the things that you would consider to be a negative factor in buying a house, especially if it's something that you're buying to not just be an accommodation where you live, but also to build some form of wealth and equity, either for your future security or for a generational legacy. Now, remember, the key thing here is to ensure that when you're making such a decision, you are able to afford it. So you have the necessary deposit and will be able to sustain the relevant payments to secure the property. And you have a means of how you are going to be able to maintain the property. So you want to buy something that is going to be affordable, something you can manage to sustain, rather than something that is going to put too much strain on you and cause you undue stress in the process. Wealth building is something that needs to be given thought, attention, and detail. And it will be different approaches for different individuals because, after all, we're unique. And so some of our scenarios might work advantageously and others might not. It's also about the approach and the method that we use when we are taking on the journey and the process of building wealth. Remember, financial literacy is revolutionary. It has transformed my life, and I believe it can do the same to yours.